Mhm.
Um, and Roger, over to
How's
you.
it going? All right. So first of all, thank you everyone for coming. And I'm going to go ahead and try to jump right into this. And before we even get started, I just want to acknowledge how hard of a topic this actually is and how difficult it is to kind of get your head around it. And there's a lot of reasons why. And I'm going to try to really clarify why there's a lot of hurdles to get to. I don't know if anyone's ever watched the Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson podcast, but that was 45 minutes of them just arguing definition of one word. So I'm gonna try to just define that as Peterson defines it, and then move on. And there's going to be a lot of presuppositions that this argument relies on. That if you guys want to, we can go into. But it's that's another topic for another time that we can clarify. So first, just to kind of introduce this, I kind of wanted to wrap it around the idea of why Jordan Peterson can't seem to answer the question of, do you believe in God? Jordan Peterson has three main go-tos. It's, I act as if God exists. What do you mean by God? And what do you mean by believe? And the more recent one was, what man dares believe what man dares say he believes in God? So I'm gonna try to explain what it sounds like his belief system is, and why those questions get really hard, and why those answers make a lot of sense. I'm also going to try to define what Peterson's view of religion is, and what the logos is, what it is, what it's not, how does it come to exist, and why do people worship it, and why does the worship of the logos require an actual leap of faith? Why is it a religious argument? And finally, real quick before we get started, I'm going to have to set up a little bit of framework here. And here's where our first hurdle already starts. And it's the definition of truth. So for Jordan Peterson, his definition of truth is not the same as what you naturally are thinking. Mostly especially in modern times, when we talk about truth, we're normally talking about Newtonian truth. In other words, the truth in the perception of reality as objects.
Roger, let me interrupt just
Go
for a
ahead.
second. Folks, this is a very complex topic, okay? And Roger is going to make lots and lots of points. Please use pen and paper or your phone to keep notes, formulate your questions, and we will come to all your questions, okay? So keep track of questions that you have as you're listening. Don't listen passively. Try to formulate your questions. Try to, take notes, look at the structure of the arguments. You can critique the structure of the arguments. So the more active you are, the more we are going to get out of the discussion. Sorry, Roger, for the interruption.
No
Go
problem.
ahead.
So yeah, but very good clarification. So for example, Newtonian truth is, you can think of them as facts without value. In other words, water freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit, aspects like that, where it's an observation, but it's nothing more than an observation. And Peterson believes that though that is true, that's not the only conception of truth that we can have. There's a second conception. And the second conception, what he calls pragmatic truth, is the idea that if you imagine, essentially the idea is that we are the best solution for existence that we are the best solution for existence that has come about that we know of. That's kind of where our starting point is, as to what he means by that, and why that's actually a different idea of truth. So you can imagine what life, and by life I mean the broadest form of organic life, what it had to do to even exist. So the first thing it has to do is adapt fundamentally to what? To real reality, to the environment as such. And though we may conceive it, I mean, you likely have an image of that. By definition, that image is already incorrect, because you're assuming that, that your perception is a reflection of reality. Essentially, when we evolve to reality, we have to adapt to a reality that's beyond just our senses. And in fact, our senses are, it's actually inverse. Our senses are actually an adaptation that's only good enough for us to survive to the next iteration, if you follow an evolutionary standpoint of this, right? So every animal is only as good as the tools that are built in. Any animal that fails or does not get the truth correct or the true expression is eliminated. So therefore, the game, in a metaphysical sense, is a game where there's a lot of random mutations, and any mutation that is incorrect or that's not even, that even just might not be useful, gets eliminated. So the conception here is that there's actually one or maybe multiple viable ways of existing in the world, but they're extremely limited. So then that's what he's going to mean by truth. Okay, so putting that caveat down, we can definitely have an entire talk about that definition and what he means by that. However, for this argument, that kind of has to be already accepted. So this is the first section. This is just the introduction. Next, we're going to evolutionary pressures. Shrikant, do you?
No, I think this is good.
Or
I
Carl?
think
Would it be would it would it
let's
be
start.
fair to say that truth in Jordan Peterson's sense is that those things you do that help you survive? So like if something is true, if you believe act in a way that helps you live to the next generation, your
It goes beyond
ancestors.
that.
Okay.
So it's not just your active choices, it's your actual body. Like, you as a being are an articulation of the one of the few viable ways of existing in this world, right? And then from there, that also includes your psychology, your perception, everything else kind of builds off of that. But it goes down all the way to your literal being as a living being is proof that the solution that evolution was able to make is at least functionally true. Though it may not be some universal truth, but it's functionally true, and it's the closest we can ever get to actual capital T truth.
So, Roger, this is very good. Please go ahead.
Okay, so with that presupposition, we're now going to move on, if anyone was here from the last talk, to a similar breakdown of how both myths and religions develop through an evolutionary perspective. So as I mentioned before, we have that life form that's adapting to the fundamental reality of existence. And this reality is only accessible to iterations that are good enough for survival. And one of the things that we find is one viable solution is for animals to become social. Once they become social, there has to be a mechanism for them to cooperate, to work together. And once they're working together, they're also having to deal with problems together. The issue with dealing with problems together as opposed to dealing with problems alone is the benefit, or at least the evolutionary pressure, pushes for specialization. If you have people that are specialized for a certain problem, you're actually better off than just picking a random person from your little group that's starting to evolve. So one of the solutions that we have come up with, and by we I mean life, not humans, is we group ourselves into a hierarchy. There are other forms of hierarchy that function as other things, but the hierarchy that we use functions as a way to select the people that are most X, right? Most whatever it is that's chosen as valuable. The idea is that whatever's chosen as most valuable is the problem you're trying to solve, right? So if you're in war or in tribal warfare, you want your best men to be the people that go and lead an offensive attack, right? So you create a hierarchy that then allows you to organize yourselves within that organizing hierarchy. That now creates that's kind of what Peterson's always going off about the lobsters, right? That the idea that even lobsters themselves can measure and rank where in the hierarchy they are. As this pressure is developing, you also develop the serotonin. The serotonin receptors that essentially link to where you should see yourself in the hierarchy. And for Peterson, that's kind of like why depression is kind of two versions. The one that when you should be depressed, where you're just a useless human being, and then there's the one where you shouldn't be depressed, you're actually doing a real good life, but your serotonin's just dropped. So, okay, now that you have the structure, you along with all that happening, and this is all happening all at once, the females start to use that structure to select mates. So that is also why there's an incentive for any males to climb the hierarchy. So you have a full system that serves from a social perspective, a solution to a dynamic problem, while at the same time helping the females better differentiate between good mates and bad mates, because the good mates are going to be the ones that can solve the problems that society has deemed are worth solving, and then also incentivizes the males to want to climb that hierarchy. So now we have all the motivations in place. So then that's the game. The game is to try to climb from the male's perspective, and also females. Females start to develop their own dominance hierarchies or competence hierarchies as to the selections and things of that nature. But from here, a natural path similar to the evolution that I was talking about earlier, a natural path to how do you climb a specific hierarchy? What is the best strategy for climbing that specific hierarchy? That then starts to be embodied in all the people that are successful, right? Anyone who climbs the hierarchy did something that allowed them to climb to the hierarchy. And for Peterson, the idea is we started to watch each other, and here's where you also get into the myth origin. You start to watch each other and you start to realize that another evolutionary trait that we start to adapt to is admiration. We start to look at the people that are successful in our hierarchies and we start to admire them, because admiration is essentially the instinct to mimic, because they have something we want, whatever's at the top of the hierarchy, normally a mate selection, and we are pushed to want that more. So then we admire them, and eventually we mimic them and dramatize them. And to dramatize them just means we cut out all the boring parts of their lives and only take the stuff we care about, right? Just like any movie or any film or any description. Like if I told you a story about what I did today and I told you every single hour, it'd be the most boring story. You want to know what's actually relevant to you. And so we start doing that. Next, we abstract from those stories. And what we abstract from those stories, or what we're trying to abstract, is, well, okay, this person was able to win this fight. I'll use combat. This person was able to win this fight. This person was able to win this fight. What did they all do? What do they all have in common that allowed them to do that, right? And what we're looking for isn't necessarily an object or even anything outside of a personality. For Peterson, from Peterson's perspective, what we're trying to do is copy someone else's personality and literally embody that. So we start to do that, and that creates our heroes. And our heroes are the people that know how to climb hierarchies, and they're valuable by the very virtue that they are the things that we select for mating, and they are the things that we strive to be. So then the next step becomes an abstraction of the heroes to figure out what's common among them that makes them heroes. What makes someone who's a good hierarchy climber a good hierarchy climber? And at that point, what you're starting to pull is, what you've essentially done is taking the ones that we've selected as the best of us, or at least the abstractions of the best of us, and then abstract the second level to see, well, what's the best of everything? And once you do that, you start to create an actual ideal that functions very similarly to a Messiah. Now, the Messiah here isn't special in a necessary sense. What makes the Messiah special is that they are embodying that personality, right? They are embodying the correct path. They are embodying the correct path, the best strategic personality, or the Holy Spirit. In other words, the spirit that should be held at its highest value, right? And that is what they are embodying. Therefore, they are the Messiah, right? So, all right, second section, that's how we get from, microbes to religious beings in a very, very, very short amount of time. The next is, I'm going to try to break down what the logos is. But Shrikant, does that make sense, at least somewhat?
That's very good. So in the first section, you talked about truth as what is needed for life. So kind of connection between truth and life. And in the second one, you're talking about kind of the social truth that is being like, given that, as a social being, what do you need to live is that you need to kind of project an ideal, and the projection of ideal and admiration of it is a critical part of how you how you live well in a social context.
So the only thing I would clarify there is that for Peterson, the same thing is being discovered here. So it's more of a discovery of the strategy to not even the strategy, the strategy is in reaction to something else, right? To some, whatever created the only options are available. For Peterson, finding out what makes someone climb a hierarchy, or what makes the people that climb hierarchies get better, that is all actually the same thing. And that's kind of his point of the logos, that the logos is kind of like the game as its entirety that has set the board for the path that we have to follow.
Excellent.
If that makes sense.
Perfect. Let's go on.
Okay, so as I mentioned before, there is the Messiah, which is the embodiment of the ideal, and then there's the actual ideal itself. And for the actual ideal itself, the idea is that that is what is to be worshipped. And why? Well, because if you embody that, that can help you solve any problem you encounter in theory, or at least according to the theory that has been tested by lots and lots, like just about every other animal's death, right, in the past. That's how we got this far. And it's been tried and true, and that's how we got this far, is the idea. So what's the logos? Well, for Peterson, because that's kind of more of a general structure of how psychologically we end up to religions. For Peterson, he believes that the Christians got the most articulated version of describing that actual scenario. And that is the idea that it's not necessarily that the Christians are right, or in the sense that like only Jesus Christ is the savior and everyone else was wrong, but rather that we're all attempting to describe this process. And that's why we kind of all seem to follow the similar structure. And as time goes on, you see more and more monotheistic religions start to form across the world. You start to see more and more of a consolidation of the ideal. Now, for here, this is from the religious standpoint, this is what Peterson kind of believes, that in the Bible, the Logos is the magical word of God that brings into existence everything. The Logos is also that which embodies Christ, and it's something that's contained within each of us and is so valuable, and is valuable that it must be protected. It's the very reason why we have rights. And that's why, no matter, like, from the Western perspective, why the fact that you have a spark of divinity, the fact that you have, that the Logos resides within you, is the argument for freedom of speech. It's the argument that no matter how stupid and dumb and terrible your ideas are, you have every right to share them, because the mechanism that you're using to do that is something that will naturally improve you as you get closer and closer to the truth. Truth here being Jordan Peterson's definition of truth, not facts only truth. Okay, so that's a religious description, but I can move on to the other section if you'd like, or you can clarify something.
No, please.
Perfect. Okay, so what the hell is the Logos? So the Logos is, I'm going to give you a couple of Jordan Peterson isms first, just to kind of give you a general idea. But the Logos is that which speaks truth into being. It's the thing that chooses which potential is created. The Logos is the truth in its full form, similar in the Jordan Peterson sense. Here's a couple of how I understand it. It's the abstracted idea of a possible answer for the game of existence. It's reality in every sense. It's the abstraction of the ideal evolutionary strategy, which by our nature we were evolved to seek out and find, right? By the very nature of the motivations that are within life, we're attempting to find the most effective and best way to adapt to the reality that we are in. And that's exactly what we're adapting to, is a reflection of that. The reason it's so hard to define logos, and the reason you'll have 1,000,001 different interpretations and definitions, is because what it is, it's supposed to symbolize the creative aspect of both human beings and God. And for Peterson, the reason that's so valuable is because that is what connects us to something divine. And here's where Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson again clash, is because Sam Harris constantly makes the claim, well, we don't need all that, abstraction or anything. We can just say well-being. We're working for the well-being of people. And Peterson has plenty of arguments, but also for Peterson, you can't make an argument that people are valuable without first explaining why they're valuable. And to do that, you run into this weird problem where, in order to say that humans have value, you have to presuppose some reason, something else that is also valuable for that to be valuable. You can't, if you want to say humans are valuable, you can make plenty of claims, but there's not an inherent justification for that. And that's what we're going to get to here in a little bit, why the logos is a leap of faith.
Let me ask. Can you repeat again? Let me ask you, what is logos? If you want to explain it in a purely secular way, what is it?
In a purely secular way?
Yes.
Yeah, I would say, hold on, I actually had one that right. So the logos is, so the understanding that helped me most was Peterson, when he's talking about the thing that brings about order out of potential, or that selects potential. Essentially, it is the if you think about potential, it's something that we all seem to understand. It's actually something that it's quite natural for us to understand, and we have a full capacity of wrapping our head around what potential is, even though it technically, from an empirical standpoint, isn't real. Doesn't actually exist, right, in any physical sense, but we fully understand what it means. And the narrative of God is that, first there was nothing, and then God uses his words to bring out of nothing, or out of the darkness, or unknown, depending how you want to interpret it, habitable order. In the same way, that is how humans function. We choose which potential we actualize. And we are constantly, always surrounded by an infinite amount of potentials that we don't know. Like the second limited part here is that we don't know what the consequences of those potentials actually are. So we have the power to change the universe without the understanding of how we're even changing it, right? And the idea here is, if you give yourself to essentially your conscience, it will choose the correct potential for you, or at least guide you to choose the correct potential. And in doing that, it will be good. So you can get non-secular all the way to the point where it will be good. The it will be good part is the leap of faith. Because you could just say, it's like, well, I'm going to follow this weird voice in my head, and then it might just lead me astray and just get me killed. And the idea here is, if you follow it and you try to manifest the truth, it will actually lead you to a good place, or a place that's desirable. That's the best situation.
Okay. Please go on.
All right. So what is worshiping the logos? What does that mean, now that we have a general idea of what logos is? Well, it's an attempt to embody the truth in good faith. Again, that ideal that we have. And to not use your magical words only for your fleeting human desires. In other words, I always conceptualized it as, we're essentially blind gods. We're gods with the full power to choose what reality comes to existence, but without the capacity to fully see what that existence actually becomes, right? So here the idea is that if you do follow your conscience and the logos within you, and try to manifest the truth in the Jordan Peterson sense, that will actually lead to the best result, not just for you, but for you and everyone else. And a very non-secular way of thinking about this is, like I mentioned, if the truth, from Jordan Peterson's perspective, is kind of the solution to the game, and we're constantly evolving to try to find the solution to the game, articulating the ideal, which is the solution, would naturally lead to the best result. Understanding the full, or following the path, the way, right, in the religious sense, following the way will naturally lead to the most optimal solution that we've been evolved to seek. And that's also where we get into Jordan Peterson's idea of meaning and the orienting reflex. But another way of thinking about worshiping is that another way is of climbing the hierarchy. And again, if you're trying to climb the hierarchy, you're actually getting closer by nature to the ideal. That's, you're on the same path. You're stumbling towards the light is another symbolic way of thinking about that. But you're essentially trying to learn to be the kind of person that can take on different things, to be a problem solver. It's to worship the logos, is to worship everything that the logos has created. So it's to be on the side of of existence, on the side of life is actually good, and life is a naturally good thing that should exist and should be supported and pushed forward in a very broad sense. If you really buy into the Jordan Peterson view, another way of thinking about it is the main way that you can worship the logos is to create valid maps of reality for you and others, right? It's to help not just you understand the world as it is, but also to help others understand the world as it is. And that's what the magic of words allows you to do, is when you speak, you aren't just affecting yourself, but you're actually changing how others see reality. And if you lie to someone, you're purposely putting, a kink in their armor, that which they'll later, if they believe you, later will move and, face problems because they trusted you. So it's this idea that the truth fully manifested will lead to good, but it's a leap of faith. It's something that you have to find out. This isn't something that could be tested or just figured out, in a lab. All right, and now I'm kind of just getting to my closing points. If there's anything you want me to clarify first.
No, that's fine. That's good. Please go on.
Okay, so a couple of other things. Peterson doesn't fully have an articulated idea of this. This isn't some established dogmatic religion.
Roger, let me interrupt just for a second. Let me just let people know. Folks, after Roger finishes, we'll be going into Q&As. So you can go ahead and keep submitting your questions in the chat. And you can also raise your hand afterwards. Okay, so you can use kind of combination of both of these things so that we can get as many questions. But whatever you've been kind of writing up, whatever questions you have, if you put it in the chat, I think that will help other people also kind of think about the questions. All right, Roger, it's to you.
Yeah, so like I said, Peterson hasn't fully articulated this all the way. He himself admits that he's still thinking out loud, that a lot of times when he is working through these, he's trying to work through this idea. You may or may not find it convincing. I actually find it quite convincing. For everyone's context, the main issue he's currently, or at least that I have yet to see him deal with, is the actual physical rebirth of Jesus Christ, or the resurrection of Jesus Christ. That's the part where he's still having trouble, or at least from the last reports that I could see, that he was still having trouble with that aspect of that, trying to figure out what it means, because there isn't one obvious one, which is the psychological one, which is the death rebirth cycle that you see all over Jungian psychology. But he believes that there's actually more there than that. And so in conclusion, when Peterson is asked if he believes in God, the question actually comes off as pretty weird, especially once you understand what he means by God and what he means by believe. So for Peterson, for believe, for him, he's always clarified. He's like, well, what do you mean by believe? Do you mean what you think you believe or what you act out? Right? What do we mean by that, by those words? Because if you say, it's like, well, do you believe in God? And I say, it's like, yeah, sure. Well, but then I go and, commit a genocide. It's like, well, do I really believe in God, or did I just say words that were actually quite meaningless? It's like, well, okay, he values action over whatever it is your self-conception of you is. And so therefore it's an action-based definition. So when you ask him, do you believe in God? And we've already talked that God is the logos. You're essentially asking, do you embody the logos fully? And this is why he struggles and responds by saying, well, okay, I act as if God exists. I act as though there is an ideal that is actually the way you should live. And I try my best to aim to that. Or he says, like, what do you mean by God? And what do you mean believe? And then the more recent clarification is, what man dares say he believes in God? Because to say that is to say that you are embodying the human ideal that we've evolved to worship and abstract. And so in conclusion, to try to bring all this to a short and sweet point, Peterson essentially believes that you should follow your conscience in unison with the truth as you see it and with good faith. And if you do that, you essentially end up bringing into reality the ideal potential. And that's why he worships the logos.
All right. Thank you, Roger. So let me just talk a little bit. Let's talk a little bit more about logos. I'll ask just a couple of questions and then we'll open it up. So the way I understand it, see, I'm not, I'm an atheist, but still I find his concept of logos to be very deep. And I see it as being connected with his concept of order and chaos.
It is.
So there is basically chaos everywhere. And the uniquely human way of making order out of the chaos is to speak, is to use speech, to think, to make sense of it, to order chaos. And that's the primary tool that we have of dealing with chaos. And that's why I think logos is a crucially important concept.
Right. And that's exactly what, but that for that same pattern is why it's identified with God, because that's the very same thing he does at the very beginning of the Bible. Is he brings out of chaos habitable order.
Yes.
That then, is the kingdom.
Wonderful. All right. So now I'm going to open it up to questions. Let's first take the questions that have come in so far. Let me see. The first thing I identify as question was from Chase. Chase, go ahead.
Oh, sure. I don't know that I can totally re-articulate what you had said that I'm responding to, Roger, but you said something along the lines of, like, in this sort of order of operations of, you were breaking down like a ethical train of thought. You said this particular step requires a leap of faith, and here's why. And I wasn't sure. I just wanted some clarification on what you meant by faith in that context, or what faith means in that context. And I'm not sure I understood why that was a necessary step.
Right. It's the same step that it's the value. So it's the same step that whenever, like I said, you can see without necessarily putting the really religious lens on, you can see how an animal could evolve to then have this idealization of a strategy that's evolutionary, right? But then you get to the end, and to follow the conscience, which is the idea that's kind of this divine part of you that is trying to lead you to a better part, right? For you to assume that what that brings up is good is a leap of faith. It's a leap of faith in the same way science is a leap of faith, in the sense that we're assuming that science is actually good for humans. Like that's a leap of faith we've already taken. We just assume that's good for humans. And as Peterson points out, it's like, well, that so far that's been the case, but if eventually, we end up designing something that actually ends up destroying all of us, then it's no longer the case, and actually was never the case, right? We just hadn't gotten to that point yet. So the value is a leap of faith. The value that following that little voice in your head that's telling you you're doing something wrong will actually be good is you believing in the idea that that will lead to be something good. And you can't find a scientific, you can make a scientific justification, but it's kind of hard. I guess the best you can make without doing a leap of faith would be, because that personality has been so evolved for the entirety of life, of being, it's so well adjusted that I can give the right choice even if you can't see it, right? But it still seems to still be a leap of faith on that system.
Okay, the next question is from Franny. Franny, do you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question about the hierarchy and herd mentality?
I'm new to this, so I'm just catching all of this for the first time, but it seems to me that when you are thinking about logos as moving towards some sort of better reality, that the people who are looking at the hierarchy, which to me kind of is like a code name for religion, are just herders. They're just people of the herd. They're not actually going into the depth of trying to create something new for themselves. So it's sort of like counter enlightenment.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it seems like. I don't know if it's right or not, but that's what it seems like. And it was just a comment from a person who doesn't understand a lot.
No, that's more than fair. And what I should clarify, and this was on me, is when I say hierarchy, I mean that's more of the structure, but within society there's thousands of hierarchies. Anything that we rank each other in is a hierarchy, right? And you have it even within a family structure, within your work, everywhere we have a pecking order that we always organize ourselves around. The difference is, what's that pecking order's, what's at the top of the pecking order? So this, like you mentioned, it's, because I understand the description. It sounds as though, well, just get into this triangle and then anyone who gets out of the triangle is in trouble. But for example, the creatives, the artists, all those, they also manifest the hierarchy in a different way, is that they create their own. Anytime you see a novel form of art, for example, it's only like 2 or 3 of them start something new. And then as it becomes more and more attractive to society, more and more people go. And then eventually you start to see a development of a ranking between the people that are really, really good at it and the people that are not very good at it in any form of art or expression. That's any form of art or expression that we deem as a collective as valuable.
Thank you.
No, yeah, of course.
Next question is from Daniel. Folks, keep your questions short so that we can get as many questions. There are many questions that have come in, so we want to get to as many questions as possible. Daniel, go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Shrikant. I'll try to keep this short. I think I can do it. There seems to be, and tell me what you think, Roger, there's a basic contradiction that you stated that Peterson believes that we should act as if God exists, but yet his theory is based upon either human causation or naturalistic causation. And so it seems to me that if he's presupposing God, what type of role does God have in this process?
So here's actually where that question of do you believe in God is the part that he doesn't like to answer, is because right now the God you're referring to is the Judeo-Christian abstracted myth of that. For him, here's the issue. For him, he says, well, like I believe in the logos, like as I laid it out. And then many people say, like, oh, well, then you don't believe in God. You don't believe in the Christian God. Like, that's not the God you actually believe in. Well, okay, except the Bible seems to be directly referencing the exact same process that he's referring to. So can you really say that he doesn't believe in that if all that is a abstracted and mythologized version of a narrative that seems to fit directly with his view of that narrative? So that's why he struggled. That's another reason why he kind of struggles with answering that question.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Quick. Yeah,
Okay.
go ahead.
He's talking about religion as a form of kind of going towards an ideal or hero worship. But when we become acquainted with the Bible, we see that that the patriarchs of the Old Testament and the New Testament apostles, they were all spiritual failures. Does he wrestle with that issue?
In what sense? Or
I think we are opening up too far. We are going too far from the.
I can answer.
Game.
I can give a quick and short one, but yeah, it is a one that we can get way more into. But the idea is that those may not necessarily be ideals, or they may be more an illustration of what actually happens if someone tries to follow that ideal. So yeah, like Peterson, when he goes through his biblical series, a lot of times points out that's like God, especially in the Old Testament, isn't exactly promising you a vacation. It's like, it's just, if you want to live a meaningful life, the way to do it is to confront the dragon, go through hell, come out of it the other side, and live a meaningful life. It doesn't necessitate it's going to be nice, nor pleasant, nor fun.
Okay. Next up is Anupama. Anupama, go ahead.
Shrikant, I'll give it a pass. I just need to wrap my head around the topic a lot.
All right. Next one is Andrew. Andrew, go ahead. Your observation about logos. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. I didn't have a question. I was just, from my perspective on what logos is that I think of logos as the deepest essence behind the universe, the deepest essence behind existence itself. So it's not something that's what I would classify as spoken truth or spoken word, or what an individual can only comprehend, but it would be like a deeper reality beyond what we could see as the truth.
Right. And that would be like, that's why the definition for Peterson is very similar to that, right? It's the truth that we had to evolve to, and the spoken truth is the attempted articulation of that deeper reality, right? As close as you can. And the idea is, especially within like even just what we're doing now, the idea is like, as we group together, we're all trying to articulate the logos, and we're constantly correcting each other to try to get closer and closer to that. But yeah, no, I would agree with that definition. That's actually probably better than what I was trying to explain. So
excellent. Sanjay, you had an observation about Stoics and how Stoics look at the concept of logos. Please go ahead.
Yes, this wasn't necessarily a question, but just a observation for me that the Stoics see logos. I mean, it's really a Greek definition, but the Greeks and Romans, they had this concept of logos as nature, as the driving force of everything, including people, and how we, they also had the concept of hierarchy and things like that. But basically, the simplest way to describe it that I understand from a Stoic perspective is nature.
Excellent. Folks, feel free to make observations as well. It doesn't have to be a question. You can go ahead and put a brief observation in the chat, and then I'll call upon you. Roger, do you want to respond to Sanjay, or shall we move on?
Oh yeah, well, that's why I said with the logos, it's just there's so many different interpretations. But if you look at all the interpretations, they all seem to kind of be pointing towards a similar thing. Like for Andrew, I think your definition works most broadly, but it's generally like nature. For the Stoics, at least from my understanding, was that they're pantheists, which is kind of the underlying implication here that everything is God in a way, right? That God is the game itself and the reality itself, the underlying reality that we can't truly interact with.
Excellent. Alisa, you had a question.
Yeah, I was just wondering, why can't one believe conceptually in the ideal of a God, but without fully embodying it? It sounded like you were equating those two. Like the embodiment would lead to a belief, but you wouldn't be able to believe it before that.
Right. Well, because the belief in it's the idea that the belief in itself, if it was truly held, necessitates an embodiment, or at least an attempted embodiment of that, right? It's similar to this. It's the equivalent of me saying, I don't believe there's a virus out there, and then someone comes in and is coughing, and I don't act on that. It's like, well, then do you really believe that there's no virus out there? Like, why? Like your actions and the things that you say about yourself would likely align if you actually believed it. And then the second problem is we don't actually know what we believe, or at least how you define belief. If you define belief as what you think, then yeah, sure, you can definitely do that. If you define belief as the way you act, the axioms that you act upon, then that by definition isn't possible, right? So I think that's the distinction.
So Roger, let me just follow up briefly on that. I mean, I think Peterson's approach to this is very close to the pragmatic approach of saying, okay, what does this mean in terms of action? And so it's like there is a tight connection between what you think and what you do. And you are using that feedback loop on a continual basis to both improve your life and move towards truth. And it's the same process, kind of process of living and process of gaining knowledge is one and the same thing.
Yeah, and just to add to that, because you just reminded me of a really good point. For Peterson, it's a corrective. It's a corrective action, because the idea, and this is a very Jungian idea, the idea that the outside defines not just your ideas of the outside, but the outside actually defines your own psyche too. So if you are constantly and consistently attempting to embody the articulation of the logos and truth, then at the same time, as you are corrected, as you find out where you're wrong and correct that, you are also correcting your psyche. Shrikant, you're on mute. There you go.
Sorry, thanks. So I'm going to give you a heads up of whom I'm going to call on next. Carl has made a number of comments, so I definitely want to hear from Carl about any thoughts that he may have. Then next I'm going to go to Sanjay. He had a question. And then we're going to go to Ron, and then Terry, and then David, and then Josh. That's what is coming up, but you can keep lining up for more questions or comments as you go on. So over to you, Carl. Carl, you need to unmute.
So what you said about, for one, I think you did a really awesome summary of Jordan Peterson's thought, and you kind of systematized it more than I've heard him say it. And it's possible it's a bit more systematized than he would actually think, but I think it's really great conception of it. In that discussion that he had with, you're pulling a lot from the Sam Harris discussion and his hierarchy discussion, but in the Sam Harris discussion, I remember him going through a number of points about different descriptions of God. It would be really fascinating. Too much for today, but at another time to go through those bullets and describe them in relation to the logos, or to this conception of God. Because in some ways those lists seems kind of random. In other ways it's all connected, but those connections aren't super obvious. And The other point I'd like to make is, this is just my personal opinion, and you described it as a leap of faith, but listening to your conscience. And I think, in my experience at least, it's possible to be led astray by ideas, or like some people may have voices in their head that are not actually going to be helpful. So if someone has a conscience that leads them in a good direction, that's a very fortunate thing. But I don't think it's a guaranteed thing at all, that if you follow the voice in your head, that it'll take you to a good place.
Right. So here's the thing. Again, a leap of faith, right? Like you had, like, it's in the same way. If you read the Bible, right, not everyone has a happy ending, right? But it's the idea that it's your best strategy, and it's the best strategy that evolution itself has been able to come up with so far.
Right.
Right. And
I think that's. I'm very skeptical of that, due to my personal experience, taking a leap of faith that ended very badly.
Okay.
And I've noticed, I just want to add, last point, is that with Jordan Peterson, I've never heard him state, listen to your voice in your head because it's a good thing. It's always hedged. He always says, this is what I did when I listened to this voice. And he talks about Jung listening to his voice, but he's never says that, this voice is a good thing and you should follow it, because everything Peterson says, he seems to be very, very careful about not taking any leaps of faith. And when he's making any leaps of logic, that he's very clear that he's making a leap. It looks like it could be this way. I have this evidence, and this evidence, but that's yet to be determined.
Yeah, I would say you should check out I think it's the second one, the Transliminal interview from 2017, because they ask him directly about both the logos and religion, and that's where they confront him with the idea of, like, why don't you like this question? And he's like, well, I don't like this question for, like, it fails on multiple levels. But yeah, that's one of the interviews that I watched that I found very useful for this topic.
Okay, I might not have seen that one. So thanks very much.
Okay, so I'm going to actually answer Sanjay's question because this has to do with our meetups as such. See, we never talk for other people. Like we do meetups on different topics. We do meetups on Carl Jung. We do meetups on Marcus Aurelius, and we are not claiming to be them, or we are not claiming to be the best authorities on them. The primary thing that whenever anybody is saying things, they are mostly focused on what they think is true. And we are talking about what we think is true. And if you want to look at original sources, you should definitely go ahead and look at original sources, and we encourage you to do that. So it is all, and I think it's important to, and the way you take ideas seriously is to evaluate them as well as possible, critique them, comment on them, talk about what you think you agree with, what you don't agree with. And doesn't mean that you're kind of speaking for them or anything like that. So that's just how, how our meetups work, and how, I think discussion works. Next up is Ron W.
Thanks. And I would just echo Carl, Roger. That was a really awesome distillation of a lot of complex stuff. That was really good. My question, especially to you, Roger, since you've immersed yourself in Peterson so much, there's one thing I'm always struck by, which is he takes this evolutionary view, but he really makes a point of not talking about what it's evolving next into. He really emphasizes preserving what the Logos has brought us to, because I think he speaks passionately about what he sees as the danger of a lot of the people who usually take the role of being the ones to say, let's move into what's next, that they've sort of lost their shit and are undermining, in his view, civilization. But I wonder if you've ever heard him allude, because if you really follow his full view, he doesn't want to talk about it, but there is this idea that there would be a further unfolding but I think he's very cautious about. He's almost like you don't talk about that in a sense.
Right, and in the very interview I mentioned with Carl, that's exactly where he stops, where he says, "Look, one of the main issues is that once we reach that wall, anything past that is just your projections. It's just fantasy." He's like, now that's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, that's how all human knowledge first starts to get, right? We first project fantasy into what we don't know and then find a way in which it can be articulated so that we can actually understand it. He says, but at that point, you see yourself a lot more than you see anything else when you reach a part where you don't know what's there. And that's also why he constantly, if you watch enough interviews, you will constantly make him say the disclaimer, I'm not talking about metaphysics here. And I think it's because he's very scared of trying to make any metaphysical claim, mostly because metaphysical claims get very iffy very quickly. So
yeah, it makes him different than a lot of people in this space who are talking. They're very enamored by what's next in a sense.
Right, and for me, what I really found Peterson to be very useful for is to find to build a scientific foundation for Carl Jung's ideas in a very like easy to follow way. Was for me, this was the appeal for me from Jordan Peterson.
Thank you.
Okay, next up is Terry. Terry, you had a comment. You need to unmute yourself.
And thanks so much, Roger. And I think it's fair to tell Sanjay from earlier on that Roger's been a co-coordinator of the DC Peterson Meetup for 3 years. So that's where the background comes from. I want to follow on Carl's point about not being able to trust the speaking of our truth. One of the things I love about Peterson is he says, we don't have a clue what the truth is. 90% of what comes out of our mouths is our Jungian shadow stuff. And that it's only with intensive, devoted effort and practice that we can begin to discern what is the truth that wants to speak through us. And that's really thrilling to me, the challenge of there is a truth that can speak through me, but my job is to get my small stuff out of the way to grow so that I can be the voice for that.
Yeah, no, very well put. And yeah, like the other issue there is that at the end of the day, we are talking about religious claims here, right? Like it is a religious claim. It's not a immediate moral logical doctrine, right?
Excellent. Next up is Josh. Josh, go ahead. Josh, you need to, yeah, go ahead.
Cool. Thank you very much. No, it took me a few minutes because it was on my phone. First, I want to echo Carl and say that Roger did a very good job in his summary of the Jordan Peterson perspective. And I'm saying that as someone who's probably seen everything that Peterson has put on YouTube and read both 12 Rules for Life as well as Maps of Meaning.
Thank you. It means a lot.
Yeah, no, I think you did. I think you did a very good job. And what I would like to do, if I can, is not so much ask a question, but instead of, even though this particular conversation is aimed more at Peterson's conception of God, it would be more interesting to me, because this is sort of what I was meditating on about a couple of days ago, which was the conception of truth, and perhaps to get a precise articulation in a manner that wasn't able to have been achieved during the Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson 2 podcasts that they put forth. Because what I found in that conversation that they had was Sam Harris was trying to put forward a definition of truth, which was something akin to mere comportment with reality, a description that comports with reality and is accurate in its facts, something to that degree. And you put down a very good definition, Roger, of the Petersonian conception of truth as being Darwinian, and that distinction between Darwinian and Newtonian in its truth. But I think where Peterson hasn't failed holistically, but failed in that circumstance, in his definition was that in that circumstance, he was much more systematic in his approach to Darwinian truth, to the effect that the implication of the definition that he was moving towards was that it became an open question as to whether or not science was true, because in the long run, science could kill us all. And therefore to put that end into the Darwinian link, into that chain, would therefore nullify and invalidate all previous gains from science. And I think that bizarre, counterintuitive result came from the fact that he was thinking on a systematic level rather than on a phenomenological level, which is, if you were to take Jordan Peterson and then integrate Heidegger, and to take an ontology that stems from phenomenology, you could, and to take all of the clear distinctions of ready at hand and present at hand, which you would get from reading Being and Time and such like that. That you could take the idea of truth and have one that was consistent with both Peterson and Heidegger, which would be something like this. And this is my concise articulation after thinking about it for quite a while, which would be: the truth is a narrative account, accurate in its facts and precise to the requirements of the circumstance, designed to collapse an emergence of attention back into unconsciousness. That is to say that we...
Folks, yeah.
Is that fine? I'm done.
Josh, if you could wrap it up. Yeah, thanks.
That's
okay.
Yeah, I'm done. That was
okay.
that was.
Can you type that in the chat?
That was what I was about to say. That's what I was about to say. Like, type that in chat, because I definitely want to look at that.
Wonderful.
Okay, cool.
Please.
But yeah, no.
Thank you. I think that was a very good kind of capturing of it. But yeah, let's put it in chat so we can continue on this. Next one up is John.
Yeah. So my question, and I'm going to try to articulate it well, but I may fail, is I'm interested in his idea of where Peterson's going with sort of the logos as an emergent property, or the archetype of logos as sort of representing God or some aspect of God. And I wanted to contrast it with sort of how we usually think of rationality and logic, and maybe that could shed light of why Peterson's all worked up about it. Because it seems like he draws a pretty big distinction between when logos sort of, when logic and reason, when they sort of arise naturally as a phenomena of a system by the subparts, acting properly, and then themselves sort of practicing good morals or good reason, as opposed to when man or humans endeavor to create the same effect on the same level. And he gives some examples of like Tower of Babel and I think like nuclear disasters and things of these natures. And I'm wondering if this is sort of why Peterson is trying to reconcile these things, because he sees that there are certain aspects of rationality that you can't sort of, that man isn't necessarily capable of designing. Is that sort of like, is logos in Peterson's mind like an emergent property of nature that's sort of archetypal in nature? I know in his lecture, in his interview, he was talking sort of about Jesus being sort of like the archetype of heroes, and so could you comment on that a bit?
Yeah. So like, what I would say is that, looking at the logos as an archetype of, because it wouldn't then be the logos that's the archetype. It's the idea of the logos that's the archetype. Because as we mentioned earlier, the logos itself is supposed to be something external outside of you that has been there since the beginning of time. But if you wanted to make the case that the idea of the logos is internal, then if anything, that would be who's the philosopher? Who's the author that wrote the line "The Witch in the Wardrobe"? C.S. Lewis. His argument of this idea that God left us the message to go come find him, right? And it's the logos. If there's an archetype of the idea of the logos, which, to some extent makes sense, it would be the thing that you seek out, that we seek out as a life. But yeah, as far as the unbridled rationality, it's the idea that we have this mechanism of rationality that's supposed to be used for everything else. And it's the Nietzschean problem that rationality should always serve us, not the other way around. We should not use rationality to then derive our values. And mostly because you have the is-ought problem, right? You can't derive what things should be from what things are. But we'll be very tempted to do that, especially once science has destroyed the system that used to tell us what had value. So I would say that that's kind of like how all that kind of falls in.
Excellent. Next up is Alice. Alice, go ahead.
Hi. Okay. Can you see me?
Yep.
Hey. So my question is a little bit hard to articulate, but I'm familiar with some metaphysical thinkers who look at the laws and principles that sort of structure reality, but those principles are not good in and of themselves, and they don't necessarily angle toward good. In fact, like our suffering is by its nature mechanical, and it's governed by many laws that operate automatically. And this is also like sort of a Gnostic conception of the universe, right? Like the part of the universe that we live in is actually a sort of tainted emanation of the real God, or the real way that things were supposed to be. So I'm just wondering, like, where in there, like, is it reasonable to define the logos as these laws and principles, or is the definition of logos inherently like the part of those laws and principles that you can use to angle toward good and value? Like, am I definitionally confused here, or is it? Am I making sense?
Kind of. So could you explain a little bit on the laws and angles? What are you referring to?
So one example might be Carl Jung's concept of enantiodromia, the tendency of things to turn into their opposites, right?
Mm-hmm.
We can recognize that as a sort of law that governs the way that things unfold, but it is neither good nor bad. It's just the way things are. Mm-hmm. Or the way that, like, does this make sense?
Yeah. I just want to clarify that we're not doing a semantic switch here where we go from it's neither good or nor bad. And it's like, well, in and of itself, maybe not. But if you're stuck between one situation and then another, you may deem it as quite bad. So just want to make sure we're keeping those separate.
Right, but like the law itself does not angle toward good. Right. And and the way that the way that I personally tend to think of the logos or encounter that idea is in this context of these are the laws that are the unseen structure that organize the unfolding of things, right?
Yeah.
But they don't necessarily angle towards good. There are sort of aspects of them that can angle towards good, if used properly, or if things happen in a certain way, but it's not necessarily angling toward good.
I think, again, I think the good here gets a little mixed up, but the case I would make from Peterson's perspective, I don't know, but taking his argument and seeing if we can push it to this, I would make the case that those laws by definition define what gets to exist, right? By definition, that it is defining the parameters in which things can be instantiated.
Yeah.
The main premise here is being instantiated is better than not.
Yeah, right.
So therefore, by definition, those rules push you towards the good. Because if you didn't, you're not around.
Yeah, I think this is the crux that I always kind of come to when I try to think about this problem, because if you're coming to it from a little more of a Gnostic perspective, existence does not equal good,
Mm-hmm.
right? Existence equals a demiurgical reality. So I guess I think this is just some place where, like, and I love Peterson, love him to death, but I think this is one of the places where I don't quite vibe.
Yeah,
with
I
him.
guess it depends on what you define as good. That's that, you know, I think you
Right.
get into that problem of like, well, what is good? Because Peterson would make the claim that our systems are set up to do things that are meaningful, and things that are meaningful are good. So not necessarily things that lead to happiness or no pain or anything like that, but things that push your development further, so that you are a constantly, you know, dying and resurrecting being that is constantly improving and getting closer and closer to that ideal.
Yeah.
So that doesn't necessitate that good in any sense of no pain or no suffering or anything like that. You know, that doesn't necessitate that it's a good thing. A lot of things that are good for you hurt.
Right. Of course.
Excellent. What we're going to do now is we are going to go to the next stage, where we're going to divide into groups of, you know, I'm going to divide it into kind of breakout rooms, 3 different breakout rooms automatically. So we can continue this discussion in a much more free-flowing way. All right. So thank you, Roger.
Thanks.
This was
Thank you guys
wonderful
for listening.
And we look forward to doing this again next Tuesday. We'll pick a topic and do that. So just hold on tight. You will get an invitation to join breakout room. Just say join and you'd be able to go there. Okay, give me just a second. All right, you guys should have the invitation. You just need to click on join to get there.